Awesome. So what I wanted to do today is just run through the basics of prototyping in Figma. Some of these things, as some of us may already know, some may be new. But yeah, goal of this session is just to walk away with new thought on how prototyping works in Figma and a little bit more comfort in being able to do prototypes in Figma. So I personally really like creating prototypes on pretty much every design. There's this quote from just literally someone at IDEO. It's spread across the internet, but no one knows who actually said it. That's just something they say at IDEO, that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. And so there's a lot that can be communicated through the use of a prototype. So you can kind of think of basically the quality of feedback that you're going to get on a design correlated with how realistic the design is. And that's kind of just the trade-off of like why you get feedback on designs versus development. It's cheaper to do in designs, but the feedback's not as good. And so you're always kind of dealing with that trade-off. So the tricky part of this is basically how realistic the design is also correlated with how much time it requires. But the exciting thing is with Figma, they've kind of brought down this time required aspect. It obviously still, the more detail you go into, does require a little more time. But overall, the time has been brought down. So some of us this really wasn't that long ago. This was like a year ago. The process of prototyping used to be something like you create your designs in Sketch, you do some silliness with a craft plugin to get the designs exported. And then you hook up the designs manually in InVision. And then if you wanted any type of animation, you'd need to go somewhere else like After Effects. And basically the glorious Figma allows for us to get all basic prototyping and even some animation done just in one spot on the same tool. So what I want to do today is just cover kind of the basics of prototyping and also go over just some common mistakes that I've seen and also that I've done in setting up just a basic Figma prototype. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between this and kind of a little playground area to show how it's done in practice. So first of all, one of the things that you want to do is kind of plan out your prototype. And the biggest thing is making sure that the designs that you're using or that you're creating pertain to a specific device. Otherwise, you're going to have a really bad time setting up your prototype. So I'm going to show how that looks. So in order to set up your prototype settings, you can just click anywhere blank on the artboard, and then this will give you your default settings. So you can change what type of device it is. Actually, you can do an Apple Watch. And then change the colors here. It's not like a super important detail, but to give you an idea here, let's say, so here's our prototype. So you can see here, it fits nicely because it was built in this device type. But if, for example, if I built in a device type that wasn't on here and something custom, or if I just have them mismatched. So let's say I'm trying to show something on the iPhone 8. You can see it's kind of a disaster here and just not going to fit well. So step one is just making sure that when you start out with your artboards, you're using one consistent type of device throughout all of the design, so you don't end up with weird stuff that goes on with your prototype. Kind of basic stuff there. The next basic thing in prototyping is the ability to scroll. So you can scroll up and down, you can scroll left and right. And then if you want to get crazy, if you have like a map or something, you can scroll. And most of this is pretty straightforward, but I'm going to show one of the tricky things, which is setting up horizontal scrolling. So we'll use this as our playground. I'll just get this up here so it's less distracting. So anyways, we want to make this guy scroll. So right now, for free, usually the vertical scrolling will just be turned on. And then if you want to have something like a nav or a floating action button or something like that, it's, to be honest, at kind of a random place in the panel, but you just need to make sure that this checkbox is clicked so that it maintains its position. Otherwise, it's going to float around with the rest of the design. So that's how we accomplish the vertical scrolling. And then the trickier aspect that's a little weird is setting up horizontal scroll. So basically, as you can see right now, nothing happens if I try to scroll that. And so basically the trick here is you need to set up a frame, the scroll area where you want things to scroll. So I'm going to change this from a group to a frame. And then I'm going to bring this in here. Like that. So it's off page. And then you have to set up a frame, and then in the prototype settings for overflow behavior, so when something is falling outside of the frame, then you can set up this horizontal scrolling. So a slight pro tip here is if you want it to, you'll notice if I do this, it kind of ends right at the edge, which isn't exactly how devices work in real life. So what I can do on this is make sure that the content is turned off, and then bring this frame in here a little further. And what that'll do is allow me to bring it here to off the edge. So anyways, that is kind of basics of your horizontal scroll. It's something that you use extremely commonly in handoff. So we have our scrolling. The next kind of basic prototyping activity that happens in Figma all the time is the use of overlays. And so what that will look like is basically for things like if you have a floating action button, if you have a modal, or there's also the case for tooltips. These are things that you want to use overlays for. And this is a place that's kind of common for if you're just getting used to it, that you're going to make your life harder than it needs to be by not using overlays. So a common thing to do instead of using overlays is have one frame and then create the exact other frame that you want with with a gray background, and then the thing pressed on top. And the reason not to do that is that you're going to have to prototype the actions on this overlay item and the interactions on this so that it closes properly. Whereas if you're using overlays, let's see all the noodles of the prototype, you can simply connect your interaction to the overlay frame and then define some of the interactions here so that you want for example, you want a background color, you want to close when clicking outside, and then you want to decide on where you want to place it. And so basically there's quite a bit of interactivity here, and you don't have to mess with setting up a background image. So you can set up both an overlay, that just opens once, and then you can also have overlays swap each other out. So if I hit this checkbox, that will swap to this overlay, which in practice just looks like you just hit the checkbox. You can't tell anything. You can also navigate away to another page from the overlay as well. And so another kind of common area of kind of doing more than is necessary. So it's basics of overlays. Anyone have questions on that?
You kind of answered it, making a whole new artboard that displays the overlays versus just having the elements like fly in. The one thing that I think is like a disadvantage to that is if you just want to show the screen of the interaction, you have to open up prototype mode, go in, take a picture, and you don't actually have an artboard that has those things just present, which is a bummer to me.
Yeah. So if you try to put those small components, those small objects in an artboard, then you lose the interactivity because the overlay needs to be a frame itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a current kind of limitation of this approach. This is great for static handoff to developers. It doesn't have the interactivity, but it's kind of quick and clear to see what's going on here. And then the overlay approach is a lot faster for prototyping itself and you can, link to this for multiple frames, but it's not really self-evident, like what's going on here. That's kind of the mess of it. That's the point.
The other thing that stinks is if you do the side-by-side approach, is inevitably the content below it is going to change and get updated. And then you're going to have to go back and update that 2 times, or just be okay with it being different.
I think it's just a trade-off of if you're optimizing toward the prototype or optimizing toward the static handoff. But yeah, that is a constraint. So moving on, kind of the last really common feature that's going to be used in your prototypes is Smart Animate. Beyond just creating kind of like Lottie style animations, you can create some pretty interesting interactions here that feel really real when you're demoing the product. So for example, here I'm on this customization page, and I want to drag stuff back and forth. So I can do that. It looks real and feels real. So I'll show how that works. So basically what Smart Animate does is it says, basically give me 2 frames that are in 2 different states. And then based on some trigger, such as dragging, Figma will kind of take the 2 states and gracefully bridge the gap between them, depending on what you tell it to do. So in this case, all that I needed to do is say, okay, I'm going to drag this presets switch, and it's set to Smart Animate here, and on drag, and basically I'm going to drag it and just connect it to this artboard, and then vice versa. If I drag the preset switch again, I just drag it to this artboard, and that's literally it. So a lot of mileage that you can get for doing something fairly simple. And then another kind of iteration of this Smart Animate is the ability to expand or grow and vice versa something. So you might do this if you're expanding a card, or in this case, you can expand these alerts. So you can see here the caret animates in terms of its direction, the title moves a little bit, and then the card itself grows, so everything looks kind of seamless as you'd want it to look. And again, this is done so simply by doing that exact same thing. I'm just saying on click and Smart Animate to this frame, and vice versa. I guess I'm Smart Animating through the entire. The thing to watch out for here, I'll show an example of this, is the layer names need to be the exact same, and the hierarchy of the layers needs to be the same. Otherwise, you'll get some jitteriness. So you can see here, this is pretty clean. There's not a lot of shakiness. Whereas if we go to this example here, well, I guess we're going to do this slide. So again, we just set this Smart Animate. And here, so you can see some of these layers aren't matched up, including the title, even though it is the same thing and they're at a different spot in the hierarchy. So you get some weird kind of fade away stuff that isn't that nice. So to fix that, you can see we'll just go down to this text. This is embedded within a main title, and then it's embedded within its text component, and then within the message. And then this guy is also embedded in the main title, text, the message. The point here is the hierarchy and the layer names need to be the same in order for this to work. So the last thing that you'll often see with Smart Animate as you're prototyping is just this ability to do animations. For example, like a loading state for a button. You can obviously trigger that based off of a click. That's kind of the last basic thing there. So in order, just a really simple example of how this might work. Kind of like this. We did this with a client the other day, just showing them how to prototype. And it looked a little silly, but it illustrates the point. So basically, you'll start out with a frame with some type of shape or whatever you want to animate. If you start out with one shape and then you go to another screen and change the shape somehow. And then the method or kind of the interaction that you're going to use here is instead of on tap, you're going to do after a delay. So we'll say just off, which is one, and then so same thing here. I'm just going to make it go back and forth. So after the delay, oops. It's all that. It's obviously very fast. So we can adjust the time it takes here. So let's slow it down. So it takes 1,000 milliseconds to go. And then here. Cool. So anyway, so say this is a loading state and you love squares and circles. Fairly easy to create something like that for a prototype to demonstrate that interaction. Cool. A couple of weaknesses. We already talked about the one with something that isn't listed here is the ability to show, or as you prototype and get more sophisticated in prototyping, some of the static handoff gets a little worse. And then there's some things here like can't execute multiple actions or multiple animations or consequences from one click. And so you have to string a lot of things together. And then some of the animation abilities are limited. That all said, it's pretty simple and pretty straightforward to do most of what you might need. And so that is my super, super quick rundown of Figma prototyping basics. Anyone have questions, concerns, or anything else?
That was awesome. Have you guys had any opportunity to play around with the new
interactive
state? Yeah.
Yep. I think those are pretty nice. I think it's going to make variants a lot more calm down.
Yeah, that's cool.
I have a newbie question. What would you say, especially now that you guys don't have that whole process of sketch and craft and envision, what would you say would be the average time that you spend on prototyping? I know it's based also on projects, but I guess like your initial prototype.
I think it depends on what type of fidelity you want. If you just want to like put a click points that allow you to go from one screen to the other, it's almost instant. You can do that pretty much immediately as you're designing it. Something with like overlays, it's a little bit more complex. Something with like animation states take a little bit more time to craft, but I would say doing things in Figma as opposed to the old way takes probably about a fifth of the time that it used to in my rough estimate.
Yeah, I feel like prototyping it's great to do often, but it often happens at the beginning of a project when you need to communicate the entire, like the first initial flow so that everyone knows what's going on. And then often in just like new types of interactions. So for example, this is one that I was going to show just as an example. We were trying to show with this client this kind of drag state on this report that kind of acted like stock charts. And as silly as it is, like this was a huge pain in the butt and required a lot of screens just to get this to work. And then kind of same thing with like a date picker here. We were trying to show this new interaction and to make it nice. It still takes a minute. I think like a couple of hours probably to put together a solid prototype with a lot of interactions. But yeah, I think it depends on just what you're trying to communicate. Like that said.
I have a question.
Yep.
It might be more for devs though, but I'm curious about the process of like actually handing off the prototype to developers for them to build it out. Cause I know that in Figma, like Figma does generate HTML and CSS, at least to some extent, right? So I'm wondering from the dev perspective, when you get that, do you have to fill in even more gaps in terms of your code, or is it pretty much kind of laid out.
I was just going to say it overdoes it a little bit. So Figma, but it kind of has it split up into sections, right? So if you grab, Travis, if you can grab a piece of text and then just show the CSS real quick. Yeah, so if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a copy CSS. So if you look, right, the whole top piece is about positioning, which is completely useless because Figma cannot, like, it assumes where this piece of text lives. And then the second piece is the font stuff, which you always copy paste. The color you always copy paste, and then the last you just ignore, right? So the first and the last piece are kind of completely useless when it comes to copy pasting stuff. But again, that really depends on what we're doing. Like for the most part, for text, you're always going to want to like just copy paste that straight up in there. But like, because of how CSS works, sometimes you'll have font family defined in a variable. Sometimes you'll have it defined differently, called differently. So you'll have to make some adjustments, but typically there's a lot of copy paste when it comes to text and box shadows and stuff like that. But yeah, they do overdo it like a lot. I don't know why they opted in to go for like position static. Like, why would I want to statically position my text on a website? Like that makes zero sense. But I mean, I guess that's how they did it.
Yeah, one of those things where it's like, it's not like Figma just generates the code and it makes the developers code faster. It just kind of eliminates the back and forth on the developer asking the designer, what font family is this? What color is it? Because like if they were to code this with width of 128 pixels, that literally means that if it went larger than 128 pixels, it would break in development. So the developers are smart enough to know what they need, but it just kind of takes out that middle area. What we used to have to do is like put all of the screens in like a PDF or something, and then draw little arrows to the text, and then write out the CSS, like how big the font size is, what the color of the text is, and that's a huge pain. That's awful. Or if you're not a nice designer, you just send it over and let the developers fend for themselves. And then it ends up looking completely different than the original mockup.
Yeah, I think still in like the development workflow, a lot of what you're doing too is coding each of these things as a component first too. So like you'll come in here and be like, okay, well, what's the height on all these? Like, oh, it's this, or it's some relative thing or whatever, or like pull out the actual image thing. And so it's a lot of like Seth was saying, grabbing like little specific stuff at a time, unfortunately, instead of Figma providing full HTML for you or whatever the visual language is.
Got it. And for all the animations and like different interactions and stuff, that's something that like devs, you're coding from scratch.
Yep. There's no, there's what Lekan mentioned about Lottie is the one that really like is the only one where you can like kind of hand it off. But for this specific thing, prototyping is more of a UX thing. And then they'll kind of run it through PMs. They'll approve it. It kind of enhances the prototype. The prototype looks much more complete. But then once it's done, we'll just like kind of look at it and then just code it up.
There's a lot of questions that like a prototype can fulfill. So for example, if you have a screen and then you have the next screen that has a modal component, there's a lot of questions about that. Like, how did the modal come in? Did it fall in from the top? Did it just dissolve into the screen? Did it come up from the bottom? And some developers just assume and they'll take it and they'll make it whatever is the most easiest way, which is totally fine. Sometimes we have things in our head. We're like, no, this needed to come from the bottom for whatever reason that you can only really communicate through a prototype. Do you like prototyping, or is it a drag for you?
I personally really like it. It helps me think through stuff that's missing, because you go to click, like you're going through a workflow and you click a button or something like that, and you realize like there's no modal or there's no kind of common interaction. I think it makes it a lot easier to be thorough in your design if you've created a prototype for it.
I agree that it's super useful for us to visualize the interactions that are not tied to anything. Like you can assume things that are wrong, and with the prototype, you can define those things better. But I'm wondering about the costs of maintaining a prototype and also, I mean, you will be changing things. This is something that you in general continue doing meanwhile the project is running, or it's just a thing that you do at the beginning until you need to have the stakeholders happy with what have been done. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can share some comments around that. Like, well, personally, when handing over a project, I don't use the prototype. I use like a different approach where everything is much more clear with nodes and like some flow charting fashion, like linear connections between one screen and the other. So those interactions are clear. And because of the things that we mentioned about a prototype, that some overlays that you're going to need, then you can't consolidate those in an artboard. And like, so a prototype for a handoff, I don't think it's a good idea, but it is a complement. It's complementary for developers to understand some of the behaviors. And if you change something on the screens, you will have to go back to the prototype and make those changes too as you evolve. So there is a cost in time, in hours of work to maintaining a prototype. I guess it's more to show some of the interactions and also do user testing. I guess that those are the two main things that I think that a prototype is useful for. But I'm sure that there might be like different opinions because it's very opinionated. It's not something set in stone, what I just said.
Yeah, saying to Matthias's point, like I was just thinking of the most recent things we've done prototypes on. Like I would say it's pretty commonly at the beginning of the project. So for example, for like visitor management mobile, we prototype these initial screens so that like everyone could kind of get an idea of like, oh, like this is what the app does in general because it's brand new and no one's seen it yet. And then we just made a bunch of changes, but we're probably not going to prototype this because it's fairly clear what's going on and what these screens should be added to. And then once you've done that initial version, then it's like I was showing with these things, unless you need to do some big granddaddy prototype for a user test, it's usually just little individual interactions to show like, this is how the drag state works, or this is how this new type of date picker works or whatever. So there's not too much maintenance in that way because it's usually like a one-off kind of point of communication that you're trying to do.
I wanted to give some color. I know this is particularly around the handoff from design to dev, but there is another way to think about prototyping when it comes to user testing. I usually like to break it down by question that we're trying to get answered. And that could also relate back to the different interactions and the features there. But my least favorite thing to test is a giant prototype that attempts to get everything in the same one link. That's usually a nightmare because there's something that's going to be broken. And then we're inevitably going to be in the middle of a user test. The user doesn't know what to do. I'm not really sure what to do because we are broken. And the user test is almost like flawed just because the prototype doesn't quite connect. But if we do break it down by the questions we're trying to get answered, does this interaction make sense to them? Where are they getting lost? Then you could break it down by the question you're trying to get answered and keep them really small and tight and really concise around exactly what you're trying to get done. And that way the designer doesn't have to spend a ton of time prototyping. The user test flows really nice and the developers can work with confidence knowing that things have been tested and ready to go.
Yeah, I think that is a great point, actually, because a prototype can get very, very complex and things get hairy. And then you will have some dead ends because you're not working with development logic. You're working with the logic that Figma gives you, with the functionality that Figma gives. So there are some conditionals that you can't cover with a prototype, or at least not like in an efficient way. So yeah, she's breaking down the prototype in features for testing, as Jean mentioned. I think that's a great point and a great idea, like a good practice.
Great. Have you guys used the technique of if you want to link, say, a navigation component and you only want to have to hook it up one time versus through every screen, the strategy and how to do that.
Yeah,
This is something I just learned, and I'm like, this would have saved me like tons of time had I known it.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that.
So I'd be interested in it, in your thoughts on it, Seth, because I was gonna present on it, but then I think it's almost not useful because you usually have design systems in a different file.
Right.
And so, but it is possible. So what Seth is saying is, so let's say you have this navigation component, and let's pretend this one's home screen, this one's devices, this one's alerts, and so on. Basically, if you add these interactions on the component itself, then when you go and use that again, those connections are stored, which is super, super nice, super, super useful. But the problem is in most cases now you have a design system that's in a different, and so those connections can't be stored. But yeah, I don't know if you've, you can just use instances like I just did, and that does help speed things up. But I don't know, if you've had any other experience with that, Seth.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Sometimes it might be better to like put nav components in your like actual page you're working on, but you're trading off giving that access to the design system. But the alternative is you would have to go through and hook up every single home icon to wherever it goes. And again, like the prototypes, kind of like Gene was saying, usually the goal is not to prototype the extent of the entire app, but more so demonstrate features and workflows. So it's very rare that we'll just say like, here's a prototype. You can explore the whole thing. Joseph kind of did that with one of the projects we were working on, and he did a great job, but it's just very hard to account for all of the different scenarios. So yeah.
Yeah, it does. It is useful if you know you're going to have a prototype with a lot of screens. I mean, something that I end up doing sometimes is doing something, for example, like this, where it's hooked up on one, and then it's like still kind of a pain, but it's at least a little faster, and you can just like place it on one screen and then go through, or copy and paste into every screen, and you get some of that efficiency. So that is a way to get like a little bit of that benefit without messing up the design system.
I think perhaps there might be a time whereby Figma might decide to take another lead from Vision's page by making a template kind of like implementation. One of the things that really helped us with Vision was that there was a way you can actually create a template sort of stuff with your prototype. So the way Figma is going, because this is a big pain in a lot of people's side, with the way we can actually reuse these particular points. So I'm actually optimistic that one day Figma is going to come up that, hey guys, there's a way you can actually make this more easier by using templates. So I'm just optimistic for Figma. So just keep the belief.
Awesome. Thanks for a good discussion on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Travisse sounds great.
Thank you.